to really learn, gain insights from their practice, to recalibrate their program interventions, their grant making, giving, in order to go forward and really have maximize their impact. A couple more things about me. I grew up in the Caribbean. Little boy, I grew up in Jamaica, and I spent my early life there until through high school, and then, of course, I left, like many students do, to pursue further studies in the United States. I did my undergraduate studies at Washington, D.C. before my graduate studies at Ohio State. Couple pieces, additional pieces of context for this discussion. One is most of the Sankofa is a small, I would say, boutique consulting firm. We work primarily for in the philanthropic sector. We do some work for municipalities and some for NGOs and such. We work domestically and internationally. And first few years of our existence, we're primarily an international focused company. We're about 20 people, 16 core, and then another sort of associates that supports our work. And so we are about 20 people strong, based in Seattle. We're a virtual company, and so our folks are spread out, including from based in West Africa, East Coast, West Coast, and such. And so the work we do is multi-sectoral. We work across different sectors. And so hopefully that little bit of foray into sort of in my background and will set the stage in some ways for some of the thoughts that I would love to share with you. What I'll do is sort of after you've gotten a little context and a little background on me, which will help to understand some of my reflections. What I will share with you is a topic that you've an abstract of some topics of the topic, and I've certainly have honed that a little bit more since I prepared it and focused it a little bit. But I would love to tell you why that topic is so important to me at this point in time in the world we live in. And I will arrive at what my challenge or struggles are with the topic. And then hopefully I will leave you with some ideas and reflections on further thinking and maybe questions for you, hopefully to stimulate your interest and some things to ponder. So that's kind of what I will do, and hopefully there will be questions. I prefer to speak just more briefly and have a more engaging, conversation, some exchange. It's my preferred format. So let me just begin by saying, unless you've been sort of snatched off this planet and been taken away to another place, another planet, you will be aware and be familiar with the global reckoning with equity and race equity and racial justice in this country that reached its crescendo with the murder of George Floyd, and the ensuing events of that, of course, the protest and the multi-coalition, multiracial protest, global nature of that protest, and pushing for accountability and for everyone to really make it clear where they stand on this issue of equity and racial equity, specifically as it is expressed in the US experience. Now, alongside that, there were some other things that were happening. Clearly, over the same period, there was this great Me Too movement. There was a focus on gender equity and accountability issues related to that. And those were experienced very clearly within the context of the US context. Uh, Alongside that as well, and perhaps even with a more global focus, have, have been conversations that largely framed around um, decolonizing development and sort of power sharing in the context of the work that I've been doing. And there has been this sort of move to be more explicit about calling for a different way of thinking about the world order, at least in the development context, to decolonize the approaches, decolonize the conversation, the models and tools that have been used in that context. Now, these conversations or discourses, if you will, seem to be disconnected in some ways, but I would submit that they are not. They are part of this larger push for accountability, for equity, in different ways, as it is expressed, both in terms of, at least in the U.S. context, the main ways that a focus of the equity movement is in terms of gender and racial equity or racial justice. In the international context, it is expressed in terms of power sharing and decolonizing the structures that basically has said that the locus of knowledge, locus of power is north to south flow, and that the models and the frameworks that have been dominant in the work in how basically conversations have happened is one that positions the global north as a source of ideas, models, tools, knowledge approaches, which then percolate down to the global south. There's been also, of course, pushback on that in terms of South-South conversation, and you'll hear that also, that another strand of the conversation, how we can cultivate more South-South partnerships and such. But again, they've all seemed to converge around some similar ideas, which I will get to in a second. Now, in the philanthropic sector, this whole idea of power sharing and shifting the dynamic is something that I come across a lot, working with different foundations who are trying to invest in grant making and do good in the world. They're being challenged to shift that approach, shift it from this very top-down model to trust-based philanthropy, community philanthropy. You're all familiar with some expressions of that. In recent years, Mackenzie Scott has shifted and really disrupted I would say, the philanthropic sector by deviating from the standard approach of giving monies with strings, and basically said she will give monies and lots of it to the organizations that she wants to give it to, with less of the bureaucracy and less of the strings attached. That is one of the approaches, if you will, that have been used to, I would say, shift the power and hopefully, I think it's intended as creating more equity in the process. So there's a lot of these kinds of things, discourses and conversations, and attempt at addressing what boils down to the lack of equity, both in terms of how the world sees and approaches philanthropy, or the world sees and approaches addressing issues that affect marginalized populations, populations that are underserved in so many ways. So a lot of these terminologies that we see, be it around power sharing, localization, decolonizing development, centering equity, creates this very swirl of concepts and terminologies that can become distracting. One is never sure if they're talking about the same thing, where they converge, where they diverge, what's the difference. But I would submit that these trends suggest that philanthropies and other actors are signaling their recognition of the need to share power with their partners, with their grantees, with the communities that they work with and seek to help. And at the minimum, they are basically saying that the poor and marginalized communities should have more say in and influence and control over what happens in their organizations and in their communities. The question and challenge in these trends is how to understand what, as I said, what connects them all, how to separate what is a fad and what's trendy from what is real and substantive difference, and therefore the need for areas that requires different solutions. What then is, in essence, is the issue or focus of these different discourses, regardless of the different labels they place on them? And how should we as evaluators, practitioners, grapple with this? What does this mean for us in terms of how we think about defining problems, how we think about what outcomes are we looking at, what kinds of be it intermediate outcomes, what kinds of theories of change do we think about in terms of interventions to address and advance equity or to power share. At the essence, in my view, they all seem to be rooted in the desire to promote equity and power sharing, as I've said. They all also seem to recognize that there is a power imbalance and there's that power and the importance of lived and living experiences. In much of the discussion, you often hear the term, we're trying to elevate or center lived and living experiences of people who are close to the problems or whose experiences can inform how the solutions should be designed and calibrated. And this is a shift. This is a shift to that away from the expert model, the experts who we know what's right for these for poor and marginalized community. And the shift is now those communities, those affected members of community they have assets, if you will. They have the ideas and such. So there's this center of trying to reckon with how do you elevate in these conversations and share power with those who have been historically left out of the conversations and treated as simply victims and problems to be solved rather than problem solvers themselves of their own situation. So at the essence, in my experience, there's what anchors all of these conversations, either at the global or the domestic side, is this demand or desire to shift and focus and elevate the disenfranchised, the marginalized, as critical in shaping their own destiny, shaping their own solutions. And again, the question then that, what does that mean for us as evaluators? What does that mean in terms of how we do our work, how we think about what are the results that should be important? So before I get into any sort of thoughts about what evaluators can and should do, let me shape a little bit more the conundrum that I have, because the challenge with these competing ideas and discourses around reckoning with equity and centering equity and all that, it's both a personal and a professional one. Right? I've alluded to the professional one as an evaluator. The personal challenge is also very critical to what brings me here on this topic. And as a man of color and a practitioner of culturally responsive and equitable evaluation, with a term that has also become more central now, CRE, as many of you know it, I have a struggle about what is my role as and do I have a unique responsibility as someone with lived experience as well as a professional evaluator to do something different and in response to this demand for addressing these issues of power imbalances and inequity and such. Well, my answer to that is not, it's not easy, because I am a trained social scientist. And as a social scientist and a student of sociology and economics, but primarily of sociology, I'm aware of the strand of thought advanced by Max Weber and one of the giants in the field of sociology and social science, that we should be value free, which means that we must not allow our personal biases to affect our scientific research. But a more careful reading of Max Weber suggests that values can and do play a role in the definition of a problem for study, but those values need not or should not affect the process of scientific investigation itself. What this says to me is that our values should and can shape questions we ask about equity and social justice, but we should practice rigorous and defensible science. So I'm struggling with that. What is my role in terms of how much of me do I bring, me and my experiences do I bring to understanding and to shaping how I do my scientific inquiry in my practice. So that's one struggle that I am grappling with, have been grappling with. So taken further, this whole idea that we can do rigorous science that is defensible, while at the same time recognizing that who we are shape the questions and understanding of the problem. If you take that further, it means to me that we should do our work in ways that challenge the status quo through helping to cut through the fog and the fads of the discourse and focus on holding those in power and accountable for real change. So at least that much I feel I have a responsibility to do in all of this this conversation. The second impetus for my focus on this topic is rooted in my own desire to see a lot of the focus on equity. Just an aside here, I attended the American Evaluation Association conference recently in New Orleans, and there was a preponderance of meetings and conferences, roundtables, discussions on the issue of equity. Everywhere you turn, there was a session focused on equity, centering equity, measuring equity, dealing with equity. And it dawned on me that a lot of those conversations still are at the level of talking about principles of cultural responsive and equitable evaluations, principles of this and such. And so part of my challenge here is we need to move from these big ideas and big principles to practices. Right? So for me, the issue is not about how do we live principles of equity or racial justice or whatever. How do we embed principles in our work? For me, we're long past principles. And for me is how do we identify specific, intentional, actionable principles to unlock these power issues, to get at what decolonizing development means, to get at what true equitable practices in evaluation in other places. What do those things mean in terms of the approaches we take, the methodologies and such? It's not just the principles, for me, it's the practice. So I'm challenged to get more clear about do the tools of our scientific inquiry, how do those really change? And what does that mean and require if we're going to do justice to move the needle towards understanding what's behind these big aspirations of centering equity and decolonizing development and whatever. What do those things mean in real practices Practices in terms of program, practices in terms of evaluation. So I'm struggling with that, and I'm sure if you are operating in this space and dealing with that, you may be asking yourselves the same question: what does this really mean as an evaluator? Do we change the tools, and what are those tools, and how we use them differently to get at unpacking, unlocking the meaning behind some of these, what I would call more, emergent and sophisticated concepts and ideas and such. And so, because much of the work that I do straddles the domestic and international space, what does equity mean internationally? Does it mean the same thing in America? Right? What I've learned is that it doesn't in many areas, that context matters in terms of understanding equity. Context matters in terms of even understanding the dynamics of gender. It's not homogenous. And so as evaluators, we're challenged to think about what is common and what is unique when we're dealing with trying to grapple with what these concepts mean in the different contexts. And how does that play out in terms of how we do our work, what gets measured, how do we define success, or define the outcomes that we are dealing with. So I'm struggling there with those ideas as well. So in a sense then, we putting the pieces together, there is this, momentum, this sort of this groundswell of focus on equity. And it's all its permutations, racial equity, gender equity, geospatial issues, global north, global south issues, and all of these. And we as evaluators are left to help to cut through the fog of that, to help our partners and our clients really get to the essence of what is measurable, what is real change, as opposed to fancy dialogue and fancy conversation. And without that, we are not, without taking on that challenge, we're just adding to the discourse without getting to what I would call a lot of distinctions without differences. And we need, as evaluators, need to ask ourselves, what does this mean and how do we get there? So how far have I advanced in my thinking about what we can do, might do on this topic? Just a few thoughts. Clearly, I haven't solved any of this, and continues to be something that I grapple with in my practice, in my conversation with my clients and partners. So what I know for sure is history, culture, and context matter greatly, and that these ideas and concepts must be contextualized, and that we have to think about, when we say issues of equity or inequity, what it's not something that can be generalized. It has to be taken into context. What were the sources, the root causes of power imbalances, inequities in a context, and even within the same country, by region, by person, by group, and understand how are those forces that create and sustain inequities and power, what are they and how are they expressed, and therefore what are the context-specific solutions that can be crafted so that we can get at identifying meaningful theories of change for solving them, and meaningful measures to track, monitor, and track and account for real change, as opposed to just assume changes. So that's the first thing that I think we must do, to really get very rigorous about contextualizing concepts and not, avoiding that difficult challenge. The other thing that I alluded to earlier, we have to start thinking about what really are the problem sets that are part of these issues, regardless of what it is, be it racial inequities. Purporting to address racial inequities through diversity or inclusion or whatever, I think one cannot simply be enamored with the concept of diversity and think that it is, while it's intrinsically good to have diversity of all kinds, the question in my mind is, what is the problem that we're solving for with diversity, with inclusion, and not just say, yes, we are for diversity, we're for equity and for inclusion, but what is the problem that we need to solve for? And again, going back to the context at the individual level, at the organization, at the systems level. So we really need to get beyond just saying, yes, we're focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have to say, what are those things solving for? What are the issues that we are trying to address? So those are two things that I'm thinking about that we need to really get clearer. We need to then get more specific about what does it mean to adapt existing tools for scientific inquiry to make them more culturally responsive. Now, everyone has this desire to get to more culturally responsive evaluation. But the science and the scholarship around what does it really take? A survey is a survey. A key informant interview is a key informant interview, right? We're not going to change the science of a survey necessarily, but we have to apply those tools in ways that are different. And what are those differences? And how specific do we have to make those in response to the different issues in the context where we work, so that they are responsive culturally, that they're getting at issues of inequity and such. So we have to move the needle on the scholarship. We have to get more specific and give teeth to what culture responsive and equitable evaluation really means, so that we can get beyond constructs and concepts and get to practice and specific tools and instruments that make sense. So let me pause there, because there are a few other thoughts, but I'm sure that what I've said has stimulated some things. So in summary, then, what message I want to leave you with is, you like I really are struggling, must be struggling with the confluence of different concepts that are have become ubiquitous in recent months, recent years, that really converge around the idea of equity, racial justice, decolonizing development, localization, power sharing, and they're all sort of swirling together. But we must caution ourselves not to jump on bandwagons without understanding what do these things mean, and as evaluators, how should they challenge us to help or get to substantive change, because it's a responsibility of us who would do in this service if we are not helping to do evaluation in service of equity. So let me pause and see if there are questions. And I have been checking the chat, so I'll look. And please feel to unmute your mic and speak up. No brave soul.
Hi, Dr. Fraser. This is Lori Wingate. I'm in the Eval Cafe room. I have a question for you. You use the term rigorous contextualization, and I wonder if you could expand on what that means to you, and like if you have any examples. Yes.
So one of so happens that I'm here speaking with one of my clients, a philanthropic entity that really has a challenge to how to embed equity within its 5-year strategy, where it's spending hundreds of millions of dollars, both domestic and internationally. And it's asking the question, how should we do a better job of focusing on embedding equity in each of the areas that they focus on? And for me, that rigorous contextualization is really boils down to a simple thing that I would call, maybe taking the vital signs of your context. in each context, you have to start with understanding and unpacking very carefully with evidence, with data, recognizing that data also have biases, but really understanding what are the issues at play, right? Who are the individuals, people, organizations that are disenfranchised, and why? What are the power dynamics that have created and sustained that in very key ways? And those need to be looked at with the right tools to understand them, appropriately. And as the starting point before you get to crafting solutions. So when I say rigorous contextualization, is that rigorous by mean the painstaking process of unpacking and understanding the issues in the context around these areas of inequity and power, because you'd be surprised that the issues that you think are really important to address, when you unpack them, they really show you that there are far more complex tentacles of power dynamics that need to be addressed, that inequities that need to be addressed in different ways from perhaps what you had thought. So that's what I mean by rigorous contextualization, taking the evidence, taking the I would say mixed methods approach, looking at different things and getting to clear and evidence-based understanding of what the issues are before you jump to solutions.
So my name is John. I'm here. So I would like you to share some typical example based on some of your experience in the international development context, coming across some of these issues within the country level of some of the areas that you've worked in.
Issues, John, of power imbalances or of possible solutions.
Just power imbalances.
Yeah. Well, I run into those quite often in different contexts. I have spent some time working in financial inclusion, financial services sector. I've spent some time working in the agriculture sector, and one of the things in the agriculture sector that I see that happens quite often is that the whole idea of external ideas of what it takes to create change in agriculture sector are influences by theories and concepts that are not grounded in the lived experiences of people who are on the ground. So there's this imbalance then of influence, right, of whose ideas carry weight. One specific example, while I was at the Gates Foundation, the foundation invested in East Africa in promoting improved varieties of cassava, which is eaten in the lake region, as a staple significantly. And because there were two diseases that were wiping out the cassava crops there, mosaic disease and brown streak disease. It killed out most of the crops, the cassava crops, so people were literally on almost the point of starvation in some communities. Now, they developed these new varieties that are resistant to the white flies that spread the disease. And in developing these varieties, they basically went for cassava stalks that were pretty tall. And as you know, you grow cassava from the stalks. So they went, the team in Tanzania was very excited about the new varieties that they developed, because they had done it in the lab and they showed promise, but they forgot to ask the people in the community, like, okay, do you have any issues with this? So my team went, and we went to Zanzibar, the breeding station, and we asked a lady, a family, what they thought of the new variety. the lady looked at me and she said, "Ah, you know, they're nice," but she said, "We eat the leaves of cassava here. That's our greens." And she said, "You see those stalks? They're 6 feet tall in the air. I can't get to them to get the greens to feed my family." So no one asked me, she said, about whether this was perfect for me or whether this was appropriate. So it solved one problem, but they didn't ask me about what I thought about it. And if they asked me, I would have tell them I can't. This doesn't work for me because I can't get to the top. Now, why is that important? This is the idea of the inequity. Both there's a gender element because she wasn't going to be asked as a woman, and secondly, she in the poor community, and so the inequities in terms of economics kept her out of the weird access and influence. And so in those ways, to me, you see huge disparities, both in terms of the disempowerment of women farmers, who are most of the smallholder farmers on the continent, and you see the exclusion of ideas of the poor and marginalized in a way that solutions that were designed to address their issues don't get to it. And so the power imbalances in terms of food security and access to productive sources of agriculture were maintained even in the face of attempts to do good.
I'm wondering if you can actually continue with that example. When you were you able to deliver back to the funder or the program sponsor what you learned from that? And do you think that had an impact on their future programming and how they operate?
Yes, it did. And with that and a similar experience with interventions in Nigeria around cassava as well. The breeding station took that information and started to use that to promote field trials with the community members being more diverse, women and farmers coming into the station, not only to try the new varieties, they try to figure out, do they cook, the way does the taste matter? Do they take a long time to cook? Do they burn up all their firewood? Do they pound well? And those of you who are from Africa know that the poundability of cassava or yam is a very important thing. Poundability means that how hard it is to pound it with to make fufu or your mash that you eat. And if it takes a long time to pound, which is done by women, and if it takes a long time to cook with firewood that women and children collect, then it doesn't really meet the need. So bringing people into the trial stations based upon the research to shift the process by which there is, what we call participatory varietal selection was one of the changes that happened in a practical way where the data used to eliminate this issue of inequity. So it's a very practical solution that was as a result of some of those findings. Other questions, ideas, thoughts?
Well, okay, this is Lori again in the room. I have another question because this is a really fascinating example. I'm wondering, so this is not an environment that you have lived experience, and you're not a woman farmer and you're not from that area. Did you experience any need to sort of beef up your cultural competence to go into that different cultural context? And did you have to adapt how you ask questions or how you collected data or interpreted data in any way?
Context matters. I grew up on a farm in Jamaica where we do plant yams and cassava. So I was very familiar with the whole culture around raising cassava, harvesting it, eating it. So that said, I didn't grow up in East Africa. One thing that I do always is my research teams, my evaluation field teams are comprised of local folks who know the context. And so that's the best way I prepare myself. I prepare myself with people who know the context. And I rarely ever put together a research or evaluation team that is not comprised of people who have the lived experiences and the cultural access that I lack when I do that work. In this country, you also have. I worked for years before I worked internationally. I was the principal investigator for Kellogg Foundation initiative called the Mid-South Delta Initiative some 20 some years ago. And the whole focus there was on doing racism and promoting economic development across the Mississippi Delta. And as the principal investigator, part of my approach then was to think about how do we get people, local people, to define the measures of success and culturally relevant indicators that they think would be important to track. And this one may sound a little bit weird and odd, but I remember asking a group of local folks, what are the indicators of success that their community is doing well? And I never forget, this young man said, I can tell how well my community is doing because all I need to do is walk through the parking lot of the Walmart and see how many late model pickup trucks there are. Now, it might sound odd to you that, and maybe a little bit, strange, but that matters for that community. His idea was, I can tell to some extent how well my community is doing because the number of late model pickup trucks in the Walmart parking lot tells me something about what's going on in my community. It may not be exhaustive, but it is some proxy for something. Now, that example is important because it shifts the idea, the power to help the local folks, to help have them define. And there are other similar kinds of experiences, perhaps even more significant, that I've learned over the years working in the 36 different countries that I've had the pleasure of working in, how people, when given the opportunity to unleash their power, can really make significant difference in how interventions are designed and in how you make meaning of data and information that you do get when you work in different places.
So, Dr. Fraser, my name is Brad Watts. I'm in the room. That's a really interesting example about the Walmart parking lot, and I'm wondering, have you ever been able to successfully integrate any of those types of measurements into your work? Because when I hear you give that example, it's like, oh, that makes sense. I'm thinking about sort of like the different economic or social things that are maybe sort of illustrated by his indicator example, but as an evaluator, I find it's the challenge of, okay, well, how do you actually sort of practically apply that into your own work? How do you put it in with the other, data and things that us as trained social scientists think, okay, these are the indicators that we have to show to prove success or failure on a project?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of triangulating things, and I think relying on one indicator, one set, is problematic because there are those, who will not be convinced that that's rigorous enough. But juxtapose against some of the other traditional measures gives you a more, I would say, currency, more leverage to say there is something to this. It is contributes to the understanding. It's not, the whole of the understanding. But you have alluded to something very important, which is how do you deal with the pressure as a practitioner, evaluation practitioner, from those who commission evaluations who are not necessarily convinced that some of those culturally contextual relevant measures and approaches are meets this, pass the smell test, if you will, and are rigorous or scientific enough. And I think that's an ongoing, I would say, challenge. It's an ongoing conversation to help to bring folks along to embrace different ways of knowing, different epistemologies of that exist in the world. I supported for years while I was at the Gates Foundation again what was called Made in Africa Evaluation, which is an attempt to really shift to identify where different ideas and ways of making meaning in the world should inform how evaluation approaches and models should be applied in ways that are different. For instance, many of you know that the value of family and community, especially community obligations in many parts of the world, Africa, Caribbean, and in Asia and elsewhere, the value is placed on community as opposed to in the individual in the West. Now, oftentimes, one of the key measures of success for agriculture households or whatever household, poor households is income, either individual income or household income. Now, when you think about that, that's all sound good and fine, and it's accepted as an approach to measure success. But one thing I've learned over the years, and learned this in a very practical experience, where a household member would say to you, yes, that's the income, but it must be discounted by all that we give away because of the obligation to take care of the cousin, the uncle, the aunt. We have to send all of those. So if you look at income, be that a household or individual level, you get a completely different picture if it's not discounted by that obligation to take care of the community and the family. In other words, based on the concept that I am not doing well if my community isn't doing well. Now, I live in a neighborhood in Seattle, and I can let you know that I've never had to give salt, pepper, sugar, or anything to my neighbor. And so, but if you live in a community in elsewhere, it's very common when I was growing up in the Caribbean that if you were doing well, and the household is known to be doing well, the neighbors come with a plate, with a bag, and you have to give away salt, sugar, whatever. So that measure of proxy for household income as a measure of success used in those contexts is meaningless unless it's discounted and contextualized by those experiences. Other questions? Doesn't have to be about what I've said, just questions for me, my experiences, happy to share. I'm full of stories. No? May I ask a question? In terms of how many of you for whom this conversation is familiar? I mean, you can just, is this a conversation you can put your, some signal in the chat or whatever, that this whole conversation around equity and the increasing expansion of this conversation around equity. How many of you have seen that or dealing with that in the world you're operating in? First perspective, one person said, okay. Questions? Well, I think you will become more exposed to it. Yes, familiar perspective. Indigenous evaluator do these conversations often. Yeah. We're dealing with this. One of my partners is dealing with this from the indigenous culture experience. We are partners with an organization to help the organization promote indigenous stewardship and getting indigenous community in Amazonia and Pacifica to do what they've been doing for centuries, which is to practice, they use their own ways and means to take care of the environment. And part of the issue is not the lack of solutions, but the constraints in their ways and means and their solutions being elevated and being valued in a way that they should, because they've been demonstrated over centuries to be low cost, high impact ways to preserve the environment. But they are not elevated to the level that they are because what carries power and influence are those that based in Western science. And so there are small ways in which the inequities create problems for even proven solutions to find the light of day. And in indigenous communities around the concept of sustainability and environmental protection, there are so many demonstrated centuries-old solutions which have been constrained and underutilized because simply they are the voices of the indigenous communities are not given access to the places where those should be promoted. And you all may be familiar with that, but it's really interesting. We have a lot of interest now with climate tech solutions. I am part connected with the Oxford Climate Tech Institute, and they are looking at all kinds of Western modern models, but yet in the indigenous communities, there are proven solutions that have been centuries old, but why aren't those given access? Why are those not being elevated? So they're just these kinds of situations which get back to my point. We must get to the issues of context of what create imbalances and what sustain inequities in ideas, in solutions, and whatever. And you will be surprised to find that the issues of inequities and power dynamics really are maybe more complex and maybe than it seems at first, which is why we have to really take the time to really do the digging on the unpacking around these issues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fraser, for taking time out of your busy schedule to be part of us and for this wonderful discussion. And thank you all for your participation in this semester's Eval Cafe. I wish you all best and happy, is it Christmas?
Holiday.
So enjoy your holidays and enjoy
you
your
all.
trip. Thank you all. Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.